For 2,000 years, the traditional Christmas story has stated that Jesus was born in Bethlehem near Jerusalem. But many scholars are now convinced that Jesus was born here in Galilee. And now there's even an alternative site for his birthplace.
Aviram? Yeah. Good, pleased to meet you, pleased to meet you.
Israeli archaeologist Aviram Oshri has spent the last 14 years investigating what he is convinced is Jesus' real birthplace.
So what is there to see?
There is nothing really to see nowadays.
Nothing?
No. In 1965, the road was built, destroying the main hall of the church, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And in 1992, when they constructed the new neighborhood, the infrastructure, the sewer pipe was cutting through the church.
Yeah.
And through the ceiling of a cave.
So the road's been built on top of it?
Yeah. So they've cut through the main hall.
During these major building works, the remains of a 6th century church were discovered, which Aviram is convinced marks the birthplace of Jesus.
Now we are in the church. It's about 45 meters in length and 25 meters in width.
Right.
The interesting thing is that the church was built on top of a cave, a natural cave, and there is only two possibilities of explaining the phenomena. The first, it was just accidentally, by pure chance, built on top of a cave. And the second is that it was deliberately built on top of the cave, and that place was the genuine place of nativity.
The traditional Bethlehem is also 90 miles away, a 4-day journey from Jesus' hometown of Nazareth.
So when in the Gospels we hear the story of Joseph and Mary traveling to Bethlehem in order to register for a Roman census, you're saying that that story needs to be challenged and questioned?
Exactly. It's a myth rather than the genuine story. In addition to all that, we have the description of Mary traveling on top of a donkey while she was 9 months pregnant from Nazareth to Bethlehem near Jerusalem. It's simply not really making any sense that she could have made that kind of journey on top of a donkey.
At 9 months pregnant?
At 9 months pregnant. Whereas the distance from Nazareth to Bethlehem of Galilee is only 7 kilometers, 4 miles.
And you think the people in the 6th century and before knew that, and that's why they built this church?
Yeah.
Do some people have vested interests in maintaining the idea that Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea?
Yeah, no doubt about that. The whole idea is that Jesus is the Messiah. And according to the Old Testament, the Messiah should come from the house of David. And David's origin is from the other Bethlehem, Bethlehem Ephrata. So that is why Jesus was forced to be born in the other Bethlehem.
To make the story fit?
Yeah.
I believe the historical evidence now points to Jesus being born and raised in Galilee, because it is here that his family lived. In the early 1960s, a Franciscan archaeologist called Bagatti went on a journey around Galilee. He wrote a book about his travels. In particular, he was looking for the villages in which Jesus' family lived. He was guided by a famous early Christian writer.
Julius Africanus, who was a Christian writer of the early 3rd century and lived in Palestine, tells us a very interesting fact about the early members of the family of Jesus, whom he calls the desposunoi, which means people who belong to the master or the sovereign.
Those called the desposunoi on account of their connection with the family of the Saviour, coming from the Jewish villages of Nazareth and Kokaba. They travelled around the rest of the land and interpreted the genealogy they had as far as they could trace it.
Nazareth and Kokaba, which is a few miles from Nazareth, were evidently where the family were based. The name Kokaba means star in Hebrew, and it's possible they deliberately chose a village that had this name Star, which was one of the symbols of the Davidic Messiah. And they probably also connected the word Nazareth with Isaiah's prophecy of the Davidic Messiah, and he calls him the branch or the shoot. Hebrew word Natsar, Nazareth.
2,000 years ago, the city of Nazareth was just a tiny village. Today, one of the largest churches in the Middle East has been built over what is, according to the Bible, Jesus' family home.
We have interesting evidence that the family farm continued to be owned and farmed by relatives of Jesus. The two grandsons of Jude, who were important leaders in the Palestinian Christianity in the late 1st century, were said to be farmers in Nazareth. And the exact size of the farm is stated, which means it must have been remembered in the Jewish Christian movement.
There still survived of the relatives of Jesus, the grandsons of Judas, who, according to the flesh, was called his brother. These were informed against as belonging to the family of David.
Another relative of Jesus is remembered here too. Hidden behind an iron gate, in what's left of the ancient church, is more proof that Jesus' family was still living here more than 200 years after his death.
Now we know that there was a person called Conan who was martyred in Turkey in the 3rd century. And when he was martyred, he said that he was a Christian from Nazareth and from the family of Jesus.
I am from the city of Nazareth in Galilee, answered Conan, and I am of the family of Christ, whose worship I have inherited from my ancestors.
When the monks were first excavating here 100 years ago, they discovered a small grotto that they believed was dedicated to this same Conan.
So here appears to be someone who comes from Nazareth. He lived there himself at some earlier point in his life. He was now a gardener in Pamphylia in Asia Minor, but he's a member of the family of Jesus. So that also tells us that there were still members of the family living in Nazareth, at least around the beginning of the 3rd century, which we wouldn't otherwise have known.
According to Begatti's guidebook, in a town 10 miles away, there was a burial site for another of Jesus' relatives.
There is a very early Jewish tradition about a certain James of Saknin. Now, he was a prominent teacher, Christian, and close follower of Jesus. Now, according to my guidebook, when Begatti gets here in 1961, the tomb is named after a James the Just.
Who is this James of Saknin? The possibility arises. There are the two grandsons of Jesus' brother Jude, whose names were James and Zochar. There's quite a good chance, I think, that James of Saknin may have been James, the grandson of Jude, who was a relative of Jesus.